The first workers that built them were told they were making water carriers for Mesopotamia. It made sense since the company that made the first working model in 1915, William Foster & Co., worked in agriculture. That 18-ton model housed a crew of 6 and was nicknamed Little Willie. Ultimately, though, it was never used in combat. From that humble and secretive beginning, tanks have become one of the emblems of military might. But which types of tanks have done the most damage? What models of those war machines left enemy armies the most devastated? Not just which tank has the most destructive potential, because that would only be a list of the most modern tanks. No, we're going to be focusing on the tanks which were put to the ultimate test on the battlefield. Number 10. The Mark II Matilda. When Great Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, this was the best tank in its ranks. Its 78mm armor would at times stand up to the 88mm German artillery that was being used in the field. Its top speed of 16 miles per hour was twice as fast as the previous model. When 16 of them went up against Erwin Rommel's famous 7th Armored Division during the 1940 Battle of Arras, they gave the Allies one of the few bright spots during the fall of France when they tore up a number of Rommel's tanks with their 40mm cannons. It would be in Africa, though, that they'd really have their finest hour. In 1940, the Italian army in Libya invaded Egypt. The Matildas took the worst of the Italian artillery easily and knocked their armor out of commission. This turned the tide against an Italian army that outnumbered the Allies 10-1. The Matildas were for a time dubbed the Queens of the Desert. It was such a stunning reversal that Hitler had to waste time and resources that would have been more strategically spent on the Soviet Union, and instead he was trying to save Italy's face in North Africa. Speaking of the Soviet Union, Britain would send roughly 1,000 of these tanks to the Red Army in 1941, and they would take part in saving Moscow. Curiously, it would arguably be the Australians that made the best use of the Matilda tank. In the lead-up to the turning point of the Second Battle of El Alamein, 24 Matildas were fitted with a revolving system of chains that functioned as whips for clearing mines and barbed wire, and they were designated Scorpions. The chain system turned out to be even better against manned fortifications. After these Scorpion tanks were included in a shipment of 400 Matilda tanks sent to the Australian military, Japanese prisoners consistently claimed during interrogation that the sight of those whipping chains approaching them would get them to abandon their earthworks. Number 9. Centurion. While development of this British tank began in 1943, none were ready for manufacture until 1945, meaning they weren't ready for combat before the end of the war. But with a top speed of 21.5 miles per hour, a cannon that fired 105mm shells with twice the penetration of the 88mm artillery piece, the Centurion was still given plenty of opportunities to prove itself in conflicts such as the Korean War. It remained in production for the British military until the mid-1960s, but its most significant engagement did not have anything to do with the UK directly. In 1967 and 1963, Israel would fight the 6 Days War and the Yom Kippur War against its neighbors Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. Centurion tanks had been sold en masse to both sides, which was the first time that the tank was used on both sides. On October 6, 1973, the Syrian military launched a surprise attack against Mount Bentnil to exploit the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. They brought 1,500 tanks against Israel's 160, making it one of the largest tank battles in history, especially for ones that happened outside of World War II. The battle was so intense that by the time the Syrians were forced to withdraw, they had reduced the original Israeli force to only 7 tanks, but they had lost over 500 of their own. The Centurion had given both armies plenty of reason to nickname the site of the battle the Valley of Tears. Number 8. Panzer III. The success of the Wehrmacht panzer units is the stuff of legend. The defeat of Poland in roughly a month, the fall of France with its numerically superior army and the British Expeditionary Force in weeks, and the conquest of the Soviet satellite countries at a rate of as much as 75 miles a day will make this the stuff of legend. While much of their success has been attributed to the use of blitzkrieg, lightning war tactics of concentrated tank forces acting independently of the infantry to disrupt enemy communications, the design of the Panzer III, the most German tank of World War II, played a significant part. With its 25-mile-an-hour top speed, 75mm main cannon, possession of a radio at a time when many tank crews had to rely on flag signals, and 109-mile range, it was perfectly poised to be the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, following its complete development in 1936. Production ended in 1943 in favor of more heavily armed vehicles, but it was still present for such battles as Normandy the next year. Some insight into its destructive ability can be seen in the larger battles where it was the main German tank. At the 1940 Battle of Hainaut during the invasion of Belgium, the equally sized French-Dutch armies and German armies came away with twice as many of the Allied tanks destroyed as the Axis tanks, even though the French Saumur tanks were considered top of the line at the time. From June the 23rd to the 30th, 1941, at the Battle of Brody, a contender for the largest tank battle in history, the 1st Panzer Group attacked a Soviet army 3 times its size at a cost of less than a third that many of their own tanks. However, as we will see in a bit, this tank superiority did not last very long. Number 7. Tiger I. Now, we've previously had a bit to say about the alleged supremacy of the Tiger tanks over American tanks in World War II, but we won't deny that the Wehrmacht weapons wreaked havoc across countless battlefields. Despite their relatively limited production run of less than 2,000 units, their lack of mobility in many European battlefields from being too wide for many forest trails, and their gas guzzling, their 88mm heavy guns were devastating, and their armor, which ranged from 1.5 to 7 inches in thickness, repelled many Allied shells with little damage. You only need to look at the top tank aces of World War II and just see how many of them were in Tiger tanks. In first and second place were Kurt Knipsal and Otto Karius. They were Tiger commanders with 168 and 150 tank kills respectively. Also, a Tiger ace of note was Michael Black Baron Wittmann, who had destroyed 138 Allied tanks and 132 anti-tank guns by the time of his death in 1944. He was a household name on both sides, and the man who was ultimately credited with destroying his tank, Joe Eckert, said of him, "He deserved to die, and I'm glad I was the one who did it." To be sure, there were ace Allied tank commanders too, such as Lafayette Poole, but they just couldn't quite rack up such high kill counts, if only because Wehrmacht tank forces were smaller and often destroyed by bombers instead of armored units. Number 6. T-54. Since a prototype was not developed until February of 1945, the T-54 was too late to take a significant part in what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. However, since the Soviet Union made roughly 50,000 of them, there were plenty to go around, and for it to be involved in many other wars in the following years. Its 100mm main cannon was the most powerful tank-mounted artillery piece in the world at the time, and it had a top speed of 30 miles per hour. The T-54 saw action in 1956 when it was used to crush an attempted Hungarian revolution. Then it was used multiple times against Israel in the 60s and 70s. The Israelis even deemed the thousands of captured units worth converting for their own use. They were also used during North Vietnam's invasion of South Vietnam, where they were considerably outgunned by the Southern Vietnamese army's tanks that had been supplied by America. They were also employed heavily in Africa, Afghanistan, and the Balkans. From Peru to North Korea, they continue to be put into service to this very day. Number 5. Type 89. Most portrayals of the Japanese military during their 20th century expansion heavily emphasize their navy and their air force. Between 1936, the year before the Second Sino-Japanese War, through 1943, Japan's military produced a modest 2,100 Type 95 light tanks, the most common of their tanks. American tanks had more firepower, better armor, and were on average about a third faster. But for a Chinese army in the 1930s, the earlier Type 89 was extremely dangerous, and in one instance, the Japanese used them in a way that spelled calamity for millions of Chinese lives. For the most part, the Japanese military doctrine for tanks was based on the French model from World War II, to spread the tanks out and have them work in support of the infantry. There was one very notable exception. On March 1st, 1933, during the Battle of Rihe, General Yoshikase Nishi needed to attack a Chinese army before it could reposition itself in new defensive formations if he was to conquer the Inner Mongolia province. He ordered a unit of tanks and armored trucks to move and attack the enemy before the infantry could fully support them. The tanks broke through and kept breaking through until they reached the abandoned city of Chengdi, 200 miles behind their initial formations. This happened on March the 4th. General Nishi had effectively launched a blitzkrieg attack more than half a decade before the Wehrmacht would shock the world with these tactics in Poland. As a result, countless Chinese citizens spent more than a decade under the Japanese heel, and many would join the 14 million Chinese who died during World War II. Number 4. Renault FT-17. With a crew of only 2 members, this vehicle might seem like it would be hopelessly outclassed immediately. When it was introduced in 1917, the French military had 2 large tanks, the Schneider CA-1 and the Saint-Chamond, that it was expected to support. It turned out that those 2 larger tanks had to be abandoned because they got stuck too easily, or they easily caught on fire. Meanwhile, even though it only housed a cramped crew of 2 with a gunner to operate either its 37mm mini artillery piece or its 7.62mm machine gun, gun, the Renault FT-17 became a fixture of French and American assaults. Its relatively light 7 tons meant it could handle forests and other tricky terrain, even if it could only manage 5 miles per hour. It proved so devastating that German units would surrender en masse at the mere appearance of one. Even though there are only 4,592 of them produced, the FT-17 was so mobile that they were still being used around the world after the end of World War I. They were often employed during the Spanish Civil War, by the Finns against the 1939 Russian invasion, and even into World War II. They were actually still in use even by 1948 in the Arab-Israeli War. A 30-year run is pretty damn impressive for any piece of military equipment. Number 3. The Mark V. On September 15, 1917, 50 of these tanks from the UK were put into combat during the months-long Battle of the Somme. After weeks of bloody gridlock, these tanks rolling at 5 miles per hour were able to cut through the German trenches. The number of casualties they inflicted on German infantry was so severe that even though early in the battle British casualties had outnumbered German casualties 3-1, by the end of the conflict, German casualties were far higher. The Mark V clearly differs from modern tanks in a number of fundamental ways. On the negative side, the Pioneer tank was extremely prone to overheating and was always extremely hot even when functioning optimally. It also exposed its crew to toxic engine exhaust. In what seems like what should be a negative, it had no forward-facing weapons or rotating turrets. However, these side-mounted weapons were good for delivering heavy fire down both sides simultaneously when the tank was near or even in a trench. A significant factor in the sheer deadliness of the Mark V and the Renault FT-17 was that there were so few German tanks brought to bear against them. Germany would only produce 20 throughout the entire war. While the German military was relatively quick to develop anti-tank weapons, they had to rely on relatively vulnerable artillery and infantry in order to stop them. Number 2. T-34. For some enthusiasts of military history, it's easier to list what went wrong with the Soviet T-34 than to list the reasons why even Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist dubbed it the finest tank in the world. Visibility for the crew was limited, and it was very difficult to train crews to use it optimally, especially when the Red Army was quite literally under the gun during the early months of the Nazi invasion. Against those drawbacks, its high-velocity artillery piece that could penetrate any German tank, its high maneuverability and 30-mile-an-hour speed, its sloped armor, so effective that one tank was hit 23 times by German anti-tank shells and still only suffered superficial damage, and the fact that it was easy enough to manufacture that the USSR could build 60,000 of them in less than 4 years leave little wonder why it was dubbed war-winning. Its greatest times to shine were stopping the German advance on Moscow, and the arguably more impressive act of stopping a blitzkrieg in its tracks in the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank war in history. Despite the aforementioned T-54 having been meant to replace it, approximately 20,000 T-34 tanks were produced after 1945. They took part in such conflicts as the Korean War and the 1967 Six Days War. In 1961, Fidel Castro personally rode one during the offensive that would destroy counter-revolutionary forces during the 1961 Bay of Pigs battle. Most impressively, post-World War II, during the 1974 invasion of Cyprus, Greek forces defending the island defeated Turkish forces despite the T-34 being outnumbered nearly 6-1 by American-manufactured tanks. Many militaries around the world still have T-34s ready should the worst come to the worst. Number 1. The M1A1 Abrams. First produced in 1978 and introduced into the US Army in 1980, this main battle tank has the greatest firepower of any tank currently serving. It's equipped with a Rheinmetall M256 120mm smoothbore gun that fires 105mm shells. The shells they fire have been able to penetrate more than 13.5 inches of armor. This is significant because that's the equivalent of the thickest armor of any portion of any tank in the world. And if you're curious what that is, that would happen to be the Russian T-72. Computer-aided aiming has a 90% accuracy rate even at moving targets that are more than a mile away. Abrams shells are made of depleted uranium from nuclear power plants, the heaviest material available. This choice of projectile material potentially causes grievous harm to America's own service members. In 2006, NBC News reported that a number of American veterans, among them Herbert Reed, Hector Vega, and Jerry Oyeda, tested positive for depleted uranium in their urine in December of 2003. If the medical side effects are as severe as the veterans claimed in their lawsuit, then considering that an estimated 410 tons of depleted uranium were fired at Iraqi targets between 1989 and 2003, shells from M1 Abrams tanks may have contributed to inflicting a massive lasting toll on the health of Iraqi citizens. and the country's visitors. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, give us a thumbs up below. Why not? And subscribe. Also, why not? Hit that bell icon. Why not? And if you want something else from me, why not check out my channel called Today I Found Out. Also, daily videos, a little bit of a different format to this, but if you like this from me, you'll probably enjoy that as well. You will find a link to it below. And as always, thank you for watching.